Good morning. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you guys are doing fabulous. I need to find, okay, there I am. Sometimes I'm a little dark when I first get on and I have to find my light. In any case, I hope you're having a fabulous Wednesday. Some of you have been up for a while. Some of you are just getting started. I apologize for being a few minutes late this morning. A little bit of technical difficulty. We do have a thunderstorm that sounds like it's rolling in, so hopefully I won't have any issues today. There's not going to be any issues today. We're going to manifest it. Okay, if you're just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a runner, a jazzerciser, usually coming to or from a workout in and around Wellness Wednesday, so you will rarely see me in anything but a ponytail. I own an activewear boutique. I'm studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling and so many things. And I just feel I have such a full heart. And I started Wellness Wednesday because I've been on a journey, a lifelong journey with depression and anxiety. And I found over time that peer wisdom is one of the most helpful things. And that's why so many support groups are successful, is because of peer wisdom. And that I just felt a calling on my heart to share my experiences, and I invite you to share yours, share your comments, questions. Good morning, Miss Stacy. Let me know if you're here, and know that sometimes Facebook doesn't show me all the things, and that if you comment or ask a question and I don't respond, it's not because I am ignoring you. It is because I didn't see you, but I see Stacy. In any case, if you have been following my page for a while, you know that wellness is a big umbrella. It covers a lot of things. And a lot of times we end up talking about mindset. So it's much more than diet, exercise, or anything like that. And wellness is individual. So your individual experiences are important. And sometimes when we share information, we can learn from each other. And just because something didn't work for one person doesn't mean it won't work for somebody else. So those are all things to keep in mind. If you have been following me for a while, if you saw last week's video on the long goodbye, which talked about slow, stretched out endings, not just with people, but with places, with things, with jobs, with dreams, with all of those things. And it's a situation where when we know something is over, but we tend to keep hanging on. So letting go is not always a single moment. Sometimes it's a process. And then grief or a grief response is often what comes next. And it doesn't always have to do with losing a loved one, although that is kind of what inspired today's episode. So originally I had planned to talk about grief last week. And then I got this idea for the long goodbye and decided that it was a good preamble to today's discussion. So let's touch on it a little bit. And again, just to be clear, I am studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, but I'm not a counselor. Anything I talk about here is not intended to diagnose, to label. It is intended for awareness and for sharing of information. So keep that in mind. So let's talk about grief. What is grief? Well, the American Psychiatric Association says that it's the anguish that we experience after a significant loss, usually a death. However, it can also take the form of regret for something lost or remorse for something we've done. It's more than just sadness. It's a deep response to loss, and it can apply to much more than losing a loved one. Shows up when we lose routines, our identity, our dreams, and sometimes even a target of frustration, which I have a personal experience with. It can be defined as love with nowhere to go, but it can also be defined as anger with nowhere to go or lost direction. And I'll touch on that. Well, I'll go ahead and touch on that now. Basically, grief looks different in every person and in every situation, and that is totally okay. So you might be wondering what I mean when I say, but also with anger with nowhere to go. I had a person in my life for a long time who I had a very volatile relationship with. We did not get along. It was semi-abusive. And I still sugarcoat it, and that's an example. It was abusive in several ways. So semi-abusive it's not me being honest with myself. And when that person passed away, I was angry. I had a bigger grief response possibly to that individual's death than I did to the death of people that I love dearly. And I don't do well with grief. I just don't. I'm going to be very transparent. Grief is a struggle for me. It shows up in a lot of different forms just with me, which means it's going to show up in a lot of different forms with other individuals. And I'm one of those people that has a tendency to want to try to power through it. And in this case, when I talk about anger with nowhere to go, when this person passed away, I had a devastating lack of closure, a devastating lack of places to put my anger towards this person. So I was forced to let go. And I was also forced to let go of that idea of ever having closure. So grief can be defined as love with nowhere to go, but it can also be defined as anger with nowhere to go or lost direction when we have a situation or a person or whatever where we have so much resentment built up inside. And I kind of experienced that with a job loss at one point in time too. Where we just don't have answers. We don't have closure. Closure may actually be a misnomer, if you will. And we have to learn to let go of those things, of that anger, of that resentment, without getting apologies or answers or explanations or understanding. So again, grief looks different in every situation and with every person, and that is okay. So let's talk about some other types of grief, which I touched on in last week's episode about the long goodbye. Besides losing a loved one, which is obviously the primary time when we experience grief, we can experience grief when we lose a job or a specific role. Empty nesters, when their children move out of the house and don't need them anymore, which again is subjective. They experience an identity shift, and that often comes with a grief response to the person they thought they were, or the person they thought they were going to be, or any of that. When my daughter moved out at the tender age of 19, which years ago would have been a normal age to move out, there was a grief response that occurred there. When I retired, even though I was the one that initiated that and I was doing it to follow a purpose, and I touched on this a little bit in the last episode, there was a grief response. There was a period of time afterwards where there was kind of an adjustment, and I kind of felt lost, and I didn't really know. I knew what I should be doing, but I just couldn't seem to quite get there, if that makes sense. We can experience a grief response at a loss of a friendship or relationship. Even though I asked for my divorce, I had a significant grief response, and it wasn't necessarily to the loss of that person. It was in response to my feelings of failure, because even though I asked for the divorce, I felt like it was still a failed relationship. It was still something that I felt like I failed at, that I could not sustain that relationship. So voluntary or not, when we lose a friend or we end a relationship, there is a grief response, whether most of the time in some form or fashion, whether it's something we wanted or not. And a lot of times, and this is where a lot of people get, and I'm not going to get into all the whys and wherefores, but a lot of people judge others because, in the case of someone that's been caring for someone with a terminal illness, a significant other, a spouse with a terminal illness, and sometimes that goes on for 3 or 4 years. And when that person finally passes, sometimes, a lot of times, more than you would think, those caretakers, spouses, then go on to find a new relationship fairly quickly. And they are often judged for that, when what people who haven't been in that situation don't understand is that by the time that person passes away, those people have already grieved that person for a very long time prior to that. So they're already past the grieving stage, and the loss of that person, while sad and devastating, is often sometimes kind of just that closure that's been long awaited for. So there can be a grief response to the loss of a friendship, a loss of a relationship, whether we ask for it or not. Again, letting go of the old you, or an old ideal. I talked last week about how for a very long time, the relationships that I entered into really never stood a chance because I wasn't letting go of this ideal person in my head that I had known quite some time before. So there was a constant state of comparison. So when I finally let go of that person, there was a grief response to understanding that that person probably did not exist anymore, that things had changed, that I had grown, that they had grown, and that no matter what I remembered or what I was comparing to, that time and that person no longer existed. And so there was a grief response to letting go of that. The benefit to letting go of that is I stopped comparing my relationships and thus find myself in one of the best relationships I've ever been in, because I stopped comparing that person to those that had come before them. And we do that a lot with relationships. We compare the new person to the old person. We sometimes hold them responsible for the sins of our predecessors if it's a failed relationship. And we place expectations on them that are not reasonable because of these older relationships. So there's a grief response when we finally let go of that and understand that there's just not anything there to compare to anymore. So letting go of the old you, and that can come with growth of ourselves too. When we finally let go of that small child that's been hurt inside and we start to move forward with new knowledge and new confidence, there can be a grief response to that too before we take that step forward. Obviously, if there's an illness or a diagnosis, then we have a grief response to losing our youth, our vitality, or feeling like our physical life is forever changed because of what's happened. Estrangement from family, there's a grief response to that too. Again, just like any other relationship, whether we voluntarily put that wall up or not, or create that separation, there's going to be a grief response to losing what we're familiar with or what we thought it was going to be. And expectations are the death of us all, y'all. I talked about expectations a year or so ago. And once I get all my videos uploaded to YouTube, I'll link that. But expectations, a lot of times our grief responses that are not related to the loss of a loved one come from the realization that our expectations are not going to be met. So that's a real thing, and that's a whole other animal. Retirement, I talked about, voluntary or not. Moving, transitions, aging. I have a couple of funny things to go along with this. Moving sometimes can cause a huge grief response. In my case, I bought a house years ago when my daughter was young, and moving out of that house and leaving that house for her did not cause a grief response. However, the small apartment that I lived in for about a year, during that time where I experienced some of my largest personal growth, there was a significant grief response to leaving that small apartment. And it was because of what my time there, and I often refer to that apartment, if you've been following me for a while, you've heard me refer to holding cells. I often refer to that apartment as a holding cell, which is a place where I was being held until my situation could change. Either I could learn or grow, or something different came along, being held for an opportunity. And that's a great topic to dig into another day that I've dug into before. Transition, any kind of transition, if it's significant, can cause a grief response. Aging, just like the illness and diagnosis, a lot of times those things come hand in hand, and there's often a grief response there. Menopause always makes me think of, and if you've been following me for a while, you know that I sometimes make Golden Girls references. I love Golden Girls. I've seen every episode probably 15 times, and I have it on when I'm going to bed at night because I don't have to open my eyes and look at the TV to see what's going on because I'm so familiar with them. But in one particular episode, Blanche thinks she's pregnant. If you're familiar, you'll know what I'm talking about. Blanche thinks she's pregnant, and of course she tells everyone she's in her 40s when she's really in her 50s, and she's hysterical. But then when she goes to have it confirmed, she finds out she's not in fact pregnant, but she's in menopause. And in Blanche's world, this means that she's no longer a woman. She's no longer attractive. She's no longer a sexual being, which it was very much what her character was grounded in. And so there's a ginormous grief response to learning that she's in menopause. And that does in fact happen for some people. Unmet expectations. We talked about this, the loss of a dream. If we've had a dream in our hearts for a long time and for whatever reason we learn that dream is no longer possible, there's often a grief response to that. Now, with that said, I'm in a disclaimer with most dreams are still possible. We just have to figure out different ways to do them. But sometimes they are not. Sometimes our goals change, our priorities change, or our abilities change. And that means that we lose a dream that we've held and we have a grief response to that. And then, of course, there's always a grief response to natural disasters, almost always. Whatever kind, whether it's fires, whether it's storms, floods. Sometimes not only is there a grief response specific to the people that have a loss associated with it, but then for people that are watching it, kind of a vicarious trauma sort of thing. And then even for people, there's even, and we've talked about this before, like a post-event depression. I talked about this last year during the storms. Even for people that are training for half marathons or marathons, they spend so much time focused on this training and getting ready that once the event is over, they experience a significant depression and loss of direction, which is a bit of a grief response. So what I'm saying here is that there are all kinds of grief and everybody deals with them differently. And you don't have to feel like it's something that you have to kind of suppress or struggle through silently, because it's not because of the loss of a loved one. So what does it look like? It's different for everyone. And what started this episode was a few weeks ago, we had to put down my grand dog. Now, for a little bit of background information, my daughter has 3 dogs, but this particular grand dog, his name was Ruger. He is the first dog that I actually ever allowed to live with me. I loved him so much that I've just, and it's not that I wasn't a dog person. For a long time, I had a fear of dogs for a couple of different reasons. I wasn't allowed to have a dog when I was a child because my stepfather lost the dog that he loved. And the truth of the matter is he didn't want another dog. And so when I would ask, I was always told no. And that's understandable. It is actually understandable. So I didn't really grow up with dogs. I had a couple of negative experience with dogs and I was kind of afraid of them. And so for this particular dog, I bonded with very quickly. He was a very gentle, well-behaved, sweet-natured dog, had likely been abused before my daughter got him. And so even during the time when she thought she was going to have to rehome him because she was moving somewhere that didn't allow pets, at that point, he was such a good dog and he already had such a hold on my heart that I said, no, bring him to me and I will keep him until you can take him back, which was completely out of character for me. So I lived with him for a very long time. He was very special to me. So when it came time, he was just old. When it came time, I had a very strong grief response. And I've often had a stronger grief response to animals than I have to humans, and I'm not really sure why that is. But there were 4 of us there when we said goodbye to Ruger, and one was my grandson. My granddaughter was not with us at the time, and her grief response was significantly different too. Each one of us was having a different grief response. My grandson was not crying, and at first I was concerned about that. But it is actually very normal for children that age not to cry. They tend to show their grief in different ways by acting out or being silent. Sometimes because at that age, at the age of 8, they don't really wrap their minds around that loss right away. He was clearly sad. He was clearly upset. But again, a completely different grief response. I was very upset, and I was actually fine until I got to the vet's office. And when I walked in and said who I was, I kind of started to lose my noodle a little bit. My daughter, my son-in-law, all in tears. Some of us stood back. Some of us had to be right there touching him. And then my granddaughter, when she found out after the fact, good morning, Miss Carla, she went into hysterics to the point where they tried to contact the vet to see if he had been taken away yet so that she could see him. But as is often the case with kids, a couple days later, everything seems normal, where with adults, we sometimes have residual responses after the fact. When my grandmothers have passed away, one I was very close to and the other one I had not seen in years, totally different grief responses there. And one when the one that I was close to passed away, I was in a situation where there was an event going on and I was the only person there that could really handle the administrative side of the event. So I did that thing that I so often do, and I just kind of kept powering through and not dealing with it. And then when that event was over, I walked into work on Monday morning and I was there about 10 minutes and I just couldn't keep it together. So it was a very delayed grief response, probably due to a sense of obligation that I had. And then I ended up picking up the phone 10 minutes or so into the office and calling my board members and saying, I just can't do this. I need to take a couple days off. And they understood. They knew what happened. They understood. And I had to take some time off and I had to go home and I had to kind of wallow in it for a little bit and then do things that helped me to put it in its right place. So again, this is just an example. These are just examples of how even in one person, a grief response can look completely different each time. We already talked about the nowhere to put the anger, loss of any hope of closure. And even me as a grad school student, when I hit the end of a training, when I hit the end of a school term, especially if it's been a very intense term, especially when my boyfriend was in the hospital and I was trying to finish up a very intense term. I had 2 classes at the time. Once all of that settled down and I came off of that adrenaline, I definitely had a grief/depression response to that and was essentially just completely non-productive and borderline useless for that entire 3-week school break because he was home and the school term was over and I was going through the motions of everything because I just at that point couldn't feel anything. I was just kind of lost in space, if you will. So again, grief responses can look completely different. They can be in response to a lot of different things, and they can look completely different for each individual and even each individual situation. So what helps? Well, no, let's talk about the 5 stages first. I'm going out of order of my notes. When I was studying for my bachelor's degree at St. Leo University, good morning, Miss Carla. Good morning, Miss Victoria. I learned about, we had to do a paper on these key figures in psychological history. And most of them I'd never heard of. So I did a little bit of poking around and I chose Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she was a psychiatrist who coined the 5 stages of grief. She was also pivotal in the hospice movement, in the AIDS movement. And while now there are some schools of thought that have like anywhere from 7 to 13 stages of grief, the additional 5 stages of death and dying, which are also known as the 5 stages of grief, were coined by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and they look like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that sounds nice and neat and tidy, doesn't it? However, it's not a checklist, and it's definitely not linear. You can bounce around, you can skip steps, you can go backwards, forward. That is all normal. So a lot of times I start out in kind of a denial or anger space. For me, I don't do a whole lot of bargaining unless the loss hasn't actually occurred yet and I'm trying to bargain out of it. There's often long periods of depression for me before I hit acceptance. Good morning, Miss Raquel. So again, these are the fairly common stages that everyone goes through when they're experiencing grief, but it's not a checklist and it's not linear. And you may or may not go through all of those steps. And you can definitely bounce around. You can definitely go backwards and you can definitely get stuck in some of those places. And that's where sometimes we run into problems where we need to talk to someone and we need to get help, is when we get stuck, especially in the denial or anger or depression parts of those, of that process. So again, not a checklist, not linear. And if you don't follow that that nice, neat, tidy list in the order that I just read it off in, it's okay. It doesn't make you abnormal. It actually makes you normal if you're not following that checklist, okay? So it's a process. Grief is a process, and it can be a very messy one, whether it's public or private. But the most important thing is that it's human, which means when you're experiencing grief for however long in whatever way, and sometimes we can think we're over it. We can think we're through it, and then all of a sudden it rears its ugly head. Yes, we go in and out of these stages and back and forth. You know, sometimes we just spin our wheels in the middle of them, don't we, Victoria? But again, it's human, and it is a process, and no one is expected to go through them in the exact fashion that they are listed off in. So what helps is to give yourself grace. It helps to talk about it when you're ready. And I talk to myself a lot, y'all. I know that the joke is that it's a sign of intelligence, but sometimes even to the point where I worry about myself. But a lot of times, excuse me, I have to talk myself through these stages before I can talk to anybody else about it. And that's okay. You have to give yourself grace. Talk about it. Honor your own process in your own time. And creating rituals is okay, such as lighting candles, revisiting memories. I have I don't know the right thing to call it, but I refer to it as a Catholic candle because at one point in time, it was one of those tall glass candles, and the shell that it was in disappeared at some point. And it's a story for another day. It's not a story for Wellness Wednesday, but this candle randomly appeared in my life around the time that my grandmother was passing away, or shortly after she passed away. And I keep that candle to this day because I just can't let go of it. So it's kind of a ritual on her birthday or on the anniversary of her death. I will light the candle and meditate a little bit. So revisiting memories, writing about it, talking about it, whatever those rituals look like, if that helps, then do them. But here's some reminders while you're nobody has a right to tell you that you're handling your grief the wrong way. And even I see some things, especially on social media, that cause me to raise an eyebrow. It's up to the individual person how they handle their grief. So here's some reminders, and here's some things to keep in mind while you're dealing with that grief response or someone else who is. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. There is also no timeline. There's just not. You have to do that in your time and your way. A lot of times, and even again, when my grandmother passed away, when my granddog died, the way I grieve is I go through and I do all the have-to-dos. And sometimes there's things on my have-to-do list that really don't need to be there, but I have a laundry list of have-to-dos, and I go through all those things. And when I'm done with those, sometimes I can go off in a corner and cry. But I always have this weird sense of obligation and feel the need to complete the things, no matter what else is going on. And then sometimes I'll just kind of stop in the middle and I'll start crying, and then I'll be like, suck it up, you got to get this done. And this is just what grieving frequently looks like for me. I don't do well with death. I have no problem admitting that. But I don't know that the way I do things is wrong either, because again, there is no right or wrong way to grieve, and there is no timeline. It's not a problem to solve, y'all. It's not a problem to solve. It's a process to honor. And it's about loss, not just death. So it is okay to grieve the things you've lost. It can also snowball. So a new loss can trigger past losses. And that's very, very common when you lose, especially when you lose a loved one. Sometimes we start ruminating back on all of the other loved ones we've lost. Or when we end a relationship, we definitely have a tendency to kind of roll backwards over all of the lost relationships. So it can snowball, and a new loss can trigger past losses. And that is normal. It's also unpredictable, and it's not time bound. I can't stress this enough. Grief is not time bound. But a bad day doesn't mean a setback. You are going to have good days. You are going to have bad days. There's some important things to remember before, and with this, I'm going to start wrapping up because I know your time is valuable. There's a general rule of thumb whenever you're experiencing grief, and this is usually related to the loss of a loved one, but it can also be related to other things. try not to make any major life decisions for at least 6 months. The rule of thumb is 6 months to a year. And that there's a reason for that, is because when we start making major life decisions like selling our house and moving, before we've had time for the dust to settle and to truly understand what the impact of that loss is going to have on our lives, sometimes it's more of a knee-jerk response than a thought-out one. So the typical recommendation when experiencing grief is to not try to make any major life decisions for at least 6 months. Obviously, if your grief response has to do with losing a job, you can't necessarily go 6 months to a year without finding another one. That's not the kind of thing we're necessarily talking about. So again, depends on the situation. But if you have things that you're convinced you have to do that are coming as a direct response to the loss of a loved one, maybe put those on the back burner and kind of let the dust settle and see what kind of an impact things are really going to have. And I have a great link that talks about why this is so important from a family grief counselor. It's a grief counseling blog, and I'll drop that link in the comments. And then another thing to remember is that if you feel stuck in the process or it's overwhelming you, you need to seek help, because a lot of times that's where some of our actual psychological disorders come from, is we get stuck in a process that we never really get out of, and it turns into major depressive episodes or major anger issues. And if we're stuck in that process, if we're really spinning our wheels and we're feeling overwhelmed by our grief where we can't function through normal daily activity, then it's probably time to seek help. And even if you're not at that point, if you just feel like you need to talk to somebody about it, it's okay to seek help. There are grief coaches. I actually know at least one certified grief coach that I can refer you to. I don't know what she charges, but she's fantastic. And there's therapy, there are support groups, there are some grief support groups here locally. And then I'm sure that wherever you are, if you're not here locally with me, if you search grief support groups near me, you are more than likely going to find some, because a lot of times you don't really know those things are there until you're looking for them. But word of mouth, like I said, a therapist, a primary care physician might be able to refer you to somebody if that's necessary. So if you are feeling stuck in the process or overwhelmed by your grief, you need to seek help. Even if you're not quite there yet, if you can kind of feel like you just don't feel like you're getting where you want to be with it, then talk to somebody. It's really important. You can talk to a trusted friend. Like I said, talk to a grief coach, seek therapy, or seek a grief support group. And most importantly, and this is really important, because a lot of times when we have a friend who is experiencing a grief response, we don't know what to do with them, especially if it's the loss of a loved one. We have a tendency to tiptoe around on eggshells. We don't know how to act. It's okay to check on them. It is okay to check on those friends or loved ones that are grieving. And I have a list here of suggestions from Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute. One of the things, we tend to not want to bring it up. We don't want to be the reason that their grief opens up, when it may be that they need to talk about it, but everybody's afraid to say something. So here's some suggestions, and I'm just going to touch on them lightly, to reach out, support the griever's experience of belonging, reach out and extend invitations to be part of a longer community, understanding that they may refuse you a lot. They may reject you a lot because they want to be alone or they don't want to socialize. But continuing to reach out and check in over time reminds them that there's a community out there, that there's someone out there that cares and that's concerned, okay? Avoid cliches. This actually says conventional questions or sayings. A lot of people dread asking how, actually she says her clients tell me that they dread being asked, how are you? Because it leads to the obvious answer of not good, which can force the social convention of saying fine, which can feel very alienating. So a better question is, how are you today? How are you in this moment? Or just hi. We want to fix. Most of us want to fix. So we want to know how they're doing, and then we want to make them feel better. And a lot of times the ways that we do that are just not helpful. Ask rather than guessing or making assumptions. Instead of assuming people don't want to talk about it, Instead of assuming that they don't want to do anything, you can ask, can I help, or do you need space right now? You can ask, do you feel like talking about it, or would you prefer a distraction? That's a great question. I'm like, that's genius. I don't know why I would have never thought of that. Do you want to talk about it, or would you prefer to be distracted? And that lets the griever know that you're okay with whatever their answer is. Is it okay if I check on you again once some time has passed? Is a great question. Emotions and needs change with time. Offer practical help, especially not the cliches. We shouldn't talk about, well, they're in a better place. And that's is something we like to say, but that's not always helpful for some people. We also like to say that time heals, and that's actually not true. The healing process looks a little bit different with grief. And it's often a wound that doesn't completely heal, no matter how much time passes. So time keeps going, but sometimes, depending on the level of grief and the source of the loss, it can be a wound that never really heals. So keep that in mind. Listen and respect the griever's process. Don't offer silver linings. That's where we're talking about those cliche things. Don't try to make it better. Because a lot of times there's, we want to start sentences with words like at least. That's in this blog too. And I'm sure I've done that at least 15,000 times. We want to start sentences with at least. But we need to be present and let the griever experience their emotions and not try to make them feel better. Because most of the time that's actually not helpful for them. So I will drop that link in the comments because I thought that was a great list of tips. Thank you, Carla. I hope that's helpful. And then, like I said, if you feel stuck in the process or it's overwhelming to you, seek help. If you have a friend that seems stuck in the process, talk to them a little bit. Don't just assume they are because that's what it looks like to you. And then it's okay to ask them if they want to maybe go to a grief support group or whatever. If it seems like they're ready. The point is to remember that it is an individual process and that it looks different for everyone and the response is different for everyone. So in any case, again, I don't know a lot about grief. I hope you found this helpful. I definitely learned some things when I was researching this. I definitely have my own responses. If you are experiencing issues, and you feel like you need a grief coach or a grief counselor, if you are local to me in Citrus County, you can go to NAMI.org or NAMICitrus.org, and there are some great resources there. And there is also a great grief support counseling group based out of Homosassa at the Friends of Nature Coast and Citrus County. I always say it wrong. It's also known as the Wings Center, but it's down in Homosassa. Again, I do know at least one certified grief coach that I could refer you to, and you can always seek therapy or a recommendation from your grief counselor. If you're not local to me, check with a NAMI local to you. They could probably have those resources as well. So I hope that helped. I hope that helped give you kind of a little bit of a dig into grief and understanding it a little bit better. Also helped give you some ideas of how to handle a loved one who is experiencing a grief response, and also helped you remember that you're human and that however you do it is okay. It's not time certain. Yes, Miss Patty. And I also think that you also mentioned a grief coach or a grief counselor that you use recently too, locally too. So, I can't read your whole message, but I'll look at it as soon as I'm done. And thank you so much for sharing. And any tips you have are fabulous. All right, y'all. That's all I have for today. I hope that you have a fabulous week. I don't know what next week's topic is going to be about yet, but I'm sure I'll figure it out soon. If you have some ideas for topics you'd like to see me cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. Remember, no politics. And I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. In the meantime, be well.